Every rule said retreat was the only option. When 600 German soldiers closed in and escape was impossible, one officer made a decision: no manual allowed. He gave artillery his own coordinates. That single order turned a surrounded position into a trap and saved everyone who should have died with him. If you value real stories from the battlefield, stories that don't make it into textbooks, hit the like button now. It helps this story reach the people who should hear it. By the morning of the 24th of January 1945, the position was already lost on paper. The American battalion was holding a thin strip of frozen ground on the edge of what remained of German-held territory in eastern France. Snow covered the fields and forests alike, smoothing the landscape into something deceptively quiet. Beneath that silence, both sides understood the truth. If the Germans broke through here, nothing substantial stood behind this line to stop them. This was not a place meant for heroics. It was a place meant for endurance, discipline, and withdrawal when the moment came. The German counterattack had been prepared carefully. Infantry massed in the woods, armor staged behind them, artillery registered on known American positions. When the opening barrage came, it was precise and methodical, walking shells across the forward line, smashing trees into splinters, collapsing foxholes, and severing communications. The ground shook under sustained fire, and the air filled with frozen dirt and shattered wood. When the barrage lifted, it did not signal safety. It signaled the next phase. 6 Tiger tanks began moving forward, their engines audible even through the forest. Behind them, hundreds of German infantry advanced in disciplined formations, using the trees for cover, closing the distance step by step. The American defenders could hear them long before they could see them. In situations like this, doctrine was clear. Infantry alone could not stop heavy armor. Machine guns and rifles were useless against thick steel. Without anti-tank guns or tanks of their own, the Americans had only one weapon capable of halting the attack: artillery. But artillery without observation was blind. The battalion still had guns available miles behind the line, batteries of 105mm howitzers waiting for coordinates. What they no longer had were eyes forward. The initial German barrage had destroyed the observation post. The forward observers were dead or wounded. From the command post, nothing could be seen. Trees blocked the view. Snow and smoke obscured movement. Firing without adjustment would waste ammunition and reveal nothing. This created a problem with no safe solution. If the artillery did not fire accurately, the Tigers would reach the foxholes. Once German armor crossed the line, panic would follow. Men would run. Positions would collapse. The Germans would exploit the breach and push deeper into Allied-held territory. Hundreds of soldiers would die in minutes. If the artillery fired blindly, it would accomplish nothing. And if it fired too close, it would kill the very men it was meant to protect. Doctrine assumed that someone else would already be in position. A trained forward observer, safely ahead of the line, protected by terrain and distance. That assumption no longer applied. The battlefield had stripped away the safety margin. Now there were only 2 facts left. The Germans were advancing, and without a forward observer, the battalion would not survive the next hour. Someone would have to move forward. Not cautiously, not temporarily, not behind the line. Someone would have to place themselves directly in the path of the attack, close enough to see the enemy clearly, and remain there long enough to guide artillery fire as the Germans closed in. It was a role that came with a simple understanding. Once you stepped into that position, retreat was unlikely, survival was uncertain, and every adjustment you called in would bring death closer to you as well. This was not an act of bravery as the manuals defined it. It was a calculation. Either one man accepted almost certain death, or an entire battalion faced it instead. And in that frozen command post, as the sound of tank engines grew louder and the gap between doctrine and reality widened, the decision had to be made. The man who understood that calculation was not supposed to be at the front. He was not a platoon leader, not a company commander, not a forward observer by training. His role existed behind maps and reports, not ahead of foxholes. Intelligence officers were meant to collect information, not become the point where it was bought with blood. By doctrine, he should have stayed inside the command post, but doctrine had already failed. He was small for an officer, shorter and lighter than most of the men who would soon depend on his decision. He had come from farmland, not from a military academy, and nothing about his appearance suggested someone built for close combat. What mattered was not how he looked, but what he had learned the hard way over years of fighting. He understood how attacks collapsed. He understood how panic spread once armor reached infantry positions. And he understood that once the Germans crossed the line, no order would put it back together. From inside the command post, he studied the map again. The terrain offered no miracle. The woods gave the Germans cover. The open ground between the American positions and the tree line gave the artillery a killing zone, but only if someone could see into it. Without that, the guns might as well not exist. The distance was clear. Roughly 400 yards of open snow lay between the command post and the front line. Beyond that, only shallow ground depressions offered any view forward. No bunker, no prepared observation post, no protection worth naming. Reaching that ground meant running under artillery fire. Staying there meant waiting while infantry and tanks advanced directly toward you. There was no rotation plan, no relief scheduled, no guarantee the telephone line would even survive long enough to be used. Once the decision was made, it could not be softened. He took a field telephone and a spool of wire, not because it was symbolic, but because it was the only way to speak to the guns. Radios were unreliable. Batteries failed in the cold. Wire was fragile, but it worked until it was cut or destroyed. The battalion commander did not argue. There was nothing left to debate. Orders existed for situations that still allowed choice. This one did not. Outside, the snow reflected a dull gray light. The earlier barrage had torn the landscape apart. Trees lay shattered. The ground was cratered and uneven. Smoke drifted low through the forest, carried by weak winter wind. The man stepped out of the command post and began moving forward. He did not run yet. He waited, listening. He knew how German artillery worked. The opening fire softened the line. The pause allowed infantry to move. Then the guns would open again, to pin defenders, while the tanks advanced. The pause never meant safety. It meant timing. When he started running, the wire unspooled behind him, drawing a thin, fragile line between himself and every man still waiting in the foxholes. Each step carried him farther from the safety of doctrine and closer to a decision that could no longer be reversed. Halfway across the open ground, the German guns reopened. Shells began landing around him, first wide, then closer. The fire was adjusting. Someone was watching. The Germans could see a lone figure moving toward the attack instead of away from it. He kept going. Every instinct learned over years of war told him this was the moment men usually died. In the open, with no cover, with no second chance. But stopping would only delay the inevitable. Reaching the front line was not enough. He had to go beyond it. Past the foxholes, past the last place anyone expected an American officer to be. When he reached the shallow depression ahead of the line, it barely deserved the name. An 18-inch dip in frozen earth, just deep enough to break his silhouette against the snow. It would not stop bullets. It would not stop shrapnel. It would not stop a tank shell. It would only allow him to see. He dropped into the ditch and checked the wire. It had held. He cranked the handset. Static crackled. Then a voice answered. The artillery was listening. At that moment, the calculation changed. The battalion no longer waited blindly. Now the guns had eyes again. But the cost of those eyes was fixed. The German infantry was already moving through the trees. The tanks were coming behind them, and the distance between observer and target was shrinking with every second. From this point forward, every adjustment would bring the explosions closer. And eventually, there would be no distance left to give. The first shells did not land where they were needed. 40 seconds after the coordinates were sent, the forest behind the advancing Germans erupted. Explosions tore through trees, sending branches and frozen debris into the air. But the infantry kept moving. They did not break formation. They did not panic. Artillery falling behind an advance meant the defenders were firing blind. The Germans knew this. From the shallow ditch, the observer watched them continue forward in short rushes, squads covering each other with practiced precision. These were not conscripts. They were veterans who understood exactly how much time they had before the fire walked closer. He grabbed the handset and adjusted. The second salvo came in tighter. This time the shells detonated among the infantry formations. The forest disappeared in a wall of fire and metal. Men vanished. Others dropped where they stood. The advance stalled, not because it was destroyed, but because it had been shocked. That was the moment the artillery battery shifted into full effect. Shells began falling in rapid succession, saturating the same stretch of ground. The Germans scattered, abandoning formations, diving for cover behind trees and into shell craters. The killing zone had been found, but the tanks were still coming. Through the smoke and shattered forest, massive shapes pushed forward, crushing smaller trees beneath their tracks. The Tigers stayed partially concealed, using the terrain, waiting for the infantry to absorb the worst of the fire. They were slow, deliberate, and confident. Artillery might wound them. It would not stop them outright. As the infantry attack faltered, the tanks emerged. The first Tiger fired its main gun. An American foxhole disappeared in a blast of snow and earth. Another shot followed. Another position was erased. The tanks were not hunting the observer. They were dismantling the defense, one position at a time. Distance mattered now, more than ever. The artillery shells began falling around the tanks, close enough to rock them, close enough to damage tracks and optics, but not close enough to guarantee a kill. The observer adjusted again, pushing the fire forward, then pulling it back, trying to pin the armor in place. The Tigers did not retreat. They advanced through the explosions, crews buttoned up, engines roaring, trusting their armor to carry them through. They knew what the observer knew. Once they reached the foxholes, the fight would be over. That was when the calculation narrowed to a single line. There was no more room to adjust without crossing it. If the fire stayed where it was, the tanks would break through. If it moved forward, it would land on friendly positions. If it moved back, it would give the Germans space to regroup. The observer looked at the ditch around him. 18 inches of frozen earth. No protection from a direct hit. No shelter from shrapnel. Just enough cover to stay alive if luck held. Luck was not something he could plan around anymore. He lifted the handset again and gave the coordinates that erased the remaining distance. The officer on the other end repeated them back, slower this time. This adjustment put the fire inside the danger zone. It crossed the line every training course warned against. He confirmed. The next salvo landed close enough that the blast waves crushed the air from his lungs. Dirt and fragments rained into the ditch. The sound was no longer thunder. It was pressure, force, something physical that slammed into the body. He did not move. He adjusted again. Each correction brought the explosions closer. Each correction bought a few more seconds for the men behind him. The Tigers slowed. Crews closed their hatches. Infantry hesitated, unsure whether advancing or staying still was more deadly. The observer had become the center of the battlefield. German artillery began responding, shells walking toward the ditch as their gunners tried to silence the voice guiding the American fire. Explosions from both sides overlapped, collapsing distance until there was no safe ground left anywhere near him. This was no longer support fire. This was survival measured in yards. And the line had been crossed deliberately. By now, the Germans understood exactly where the artillery fire was coming from. They could see the thin line of wire cutting across the snow. They could see where shells kept tightening, collapsing inward around a single point. The Tigers began shifting their formation, angling their advance not toward the American foxholes, but toward the shallow depression ahead of them. Toward him. German counter-battery fire intensified. Shells started landing closer together, probing, adjusting. One burst exploded behind the ditch. Another detonated to the side. The distance between impacts shrank with methodical precision. This was no accident. Someone was hunting him. The observer stayed where he was, counting seconds between detonations, listening to the tone of the incoming rounds. He no longer needed to see the Germans to know how close they were. He could hear them. Boots crunching through snow, engines grinding forward, shouted commands carried through smoke and wind. The Tigers were inside 200 yards now. At that distance, their machine guns could rake the foxholes. Their main guns could fire point blank. Once they reached the line, the battalion would break, men would scatter. Discipline would vanish under steel and fire. There was only one way left to stop them. He lifted the handset again. "Fire on my position." The voice on the other end froze. The coordinates were repeated back slowly, deliberately. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not confusion. It was confirmation. Calling fire on your own position was not written into doctrine. It was something that existed only in desperation, when all other lines had collapsed. He confirmed again. The first shells landed just beyond the ditch. The concussion slammed into his body, lifting him off the frozen ground. Air vanished from his lungs. The world narrowed into pressure and sound. Dirt and metal fragments screamed overhead, tearing through branches, burying themselves inches from his hands. He stayed down and adjusted. Drop. Another salvo landed closer. Heat washed over him. Shrapnel tore through the air just above the edge of the ditch. If he raised his head, it would be gone. If he stood, there would be nothing left to identify. The Tigers stopped advancing. Tank commanders slammed their hatches shut. Even armored crews did not want to sit inside steel boxes while artillery detonated at point-blank range. Tracks churned, then halted. Engines idled, uncertain. But the infantry did not stop. German soldiers crawled forward using shell craters for cover, staying tight behind the tanks, using armor as moving shields. They were close enough now that individual faces were visible through smoke and snow. The observer adjusted again. Shells walked back and forth across the approach, creating a wall of explosions between himself and the advancing Germans. Every movement was punished. Every attempt to rush forward ended in fire. A shell detonated close enough to tear into his shoulder. He felt the impact, then nothing. Numbness spread. He switched the handset to his other hand and kept calling corrections. This was no longer about precision. It was about denying space. The artillery battery began reporting ammunition levels. They could not sustain this rate forever. Minutes mattered now, not hours. Still, he stayed. Every instinct screamed to pull back, to survive, to let someone else take over. But there was no one else. Leaving meant silence. Silence meant the Tigers would move again. So he remained in that shallow ditch, pinned between two artillery barrages, deliberately holding the fire as close as the ground would allow. The battlefield revolved around one fixed point, and as long as he stayed there, the Germans could not cross it. The fire could not last forever. The artillery battery reported what everyone already feared. Ammunition was running low. The guns had been firing at a sustained rate far beyond what was meant for a single engagement. Barrels were overheating. Crews were exhausted. In minutes, not hours, the guns would have to slow or stop. When that happened, the Germans would move again. The observer had been in the ditch for over an hour. The cold had worked its way through his body until it no longer felt sharp, only heavy. His hands were numb. His legs barely responded when he shifted position. Each explosion sent frozen dirt cascading down onto his helmet and into his collar. German artillery continued to probe. Shells landed behind him, then closer still. The enemy gunners were walking their fire toward the ditch, narrowing the bracket with professional patience. It was only a matter of time before one shell landed directly on him. He countered by shifting fire again, not just at the tanks, not just at the infantry, at everything that tried to move. When small groups of German soldiers attempted to reposition, shells fell on them. When tanks edged forward, fire dropped directly in front of their tracks. The observer was no longer reacting to the attack. He was shaping it, forcing it to hesitate, fragment, and stall. A second man reached the ditch. A private, sent forward with extra wire and a backup handset, crawled into position beside him. The man was young, terrified, and determined. He did not speak much. He watched the approaches and called out movement. When the observer's voice faltered, the private steadied the line. The Germans were closer now, close enough that voices carried clearly through the smoke, close enough to hear officers issuing hand signals instead of shouting. They knew sound would give them away. The ditch had become the focal point of the entire battlefield. American soldiers in the foxholes could see it. They could see shells landing impossibly close, could see dirt and fragments leaping into the air around a single shallow depression ahead of their line. They understood what was happening, even if they could not hear the orders being given. One man was holding the fire where it was killing him slowly. German infantry tried again, advancing in a low rush, using shell craters and fallen trees for cover. They closed to within yards. The observer adjusted fire another few steps closer. Explosions tore the ground apart between him and them. Men disappeared. The survivors flattened themselves into the snow, unwilling to move. A shell detonated near the ditch. Something struck the private beside him. The private cried out. Blood spread dark across the snow. Shrapnel had torn into his leg. The observer dragged him deeper into what little cover existed. The private refused evacuation. He stayed, rifle ready, still calling out movement, still watching. Time stretched. Every second was borrowed. Every adjustment stole another breath from the guns behind the line. The observer knew exactly how this would end if the Germans found a gap. He also knew that leaving would create that gap instantly. So he stayed. When German artillery briefly lifted, he called counter-battery fire. American guns shifted, hammering enemy positions miles behind the front. The pressure eased. The probing shells stopped. The Germans tried one last time. A small group rushed from cover, sprinting across open ground, hoping to close the distance before the fire could adjust. They made it halfway. Then the shells arrived. After that, no one advanced. The Tigers sat silent, blind, and damaged. Infantry withdrew slowly, dragging wounded, leaving bodies behind in the cratered snow. The attack collapsed, not in a single moment, but in the realization that moving forward meant certain death. Hours after he had left the command post, the observer finally stood. His legs barely held him. His body ached in places he could not yet feel. The battlefield ahead looked unreal. Overlapping craters, shattered trees, wrecked armor. Stillness where motion had once been constant. The line had held. Not because doctrine worked, not because armor failed, but because one man had refused to give ground when there was nowhere left to retreat. When the artillery finally stopped, the silence felt unnatural. For hours, sound had defined survival. Explosions, engines, shouted commands, the constant pressure of steel and fire. When it ended, the absence of noise was almost disorienting. Wind moved through shattered trees. Somewhere in the distance, wounded men called out, their voices thin and uneven. The observer remained in the ditch longer than necessary, not because he expected another attack, but because his body no longer responded the way it should have. Muscles locked from cold and tension, joints resisted movement. He tested his legs carefully, one step at a time, as if standing might undo the fragile balance that had kept him alive. The wounded private beside him tried to rise and failed. Together, slowly, they made their way back toward the American line. Soldiers emerged from foxholes as they approached. No one cheered. No one spoke. They simply watched, eyes moving from the man walking toward them to the ground ahead of the line. The forest no longer looked like terrain. It looked like something broken beyond repair. Craters overlapped craters. Pieces of metal lay twisted in the snow. Dark shapes marked where men had fallen and not risen again. The tigers sat motionless, hulks of steel stripped of motion and purpose. The battalion commander met them without ceremony. He looked once at the battlefield, once at the observer, and nodded. That was all that needed to be said. Medics took the private away. He would live. The wound was serious but clean. The cold had slowed the bleeding. In another context, it might have killed him. Here, it had saved him. Only then did the observer feel the pain. A medic examined his shoulder and found the cause. A small piece of shrapnel embedded just beneath the skin. It was removed quickly, almost casually. Another injury among many. Another mark that would fade with time. The official counts would come later. Bodies recovered, equipment catalogued, reports written, numbers assigned to what had happened. What mattered was simpler. The German counterattack had failed. The line had held. No breakthrough followed. No collapse rippled down the front. The Germans would not attempt another assault here. For the men who had waited in the foxholes, the difference between life and death had been measured in yards. For the man who had lain in the ditch, it had been measured in seconds. He returned to his duties without comment. There were no speeches, no celebration. The war moved on, indifferent to individual decisions. Other battles waited. Other lines would be tested elsewhere. When recognition came, it arrived quietly. An award presented, a citation read, words describing actions that felt distant even to the man who had taken them. He accepted it without argument and without pride. Later, much later, people would argue about what that day meant, about rules broken, about courage beyond doctrine, about whether a single decision could outweigh everything written in manuals and field regulations. But on the 24th of January, 1945, none of that existed. There was only a frozen stretch of ground, a failing line, and one decision made when no better option remained. And because of that decision, an entire battalion walked away from a place they were never meant to leave alive. The war did not pause to reflect on what had happened. Within days, the line shifted, units rotated, maps were redrawn, new objectives replaced old ones. The frozen ground where the artillery had fallen became just another scar in a landscape already covered in them. What had nearly become a disaster was filed away as a successful defense. The man at the center of it returned to anonymity. He did not speak about the ditch. He did not explain the calculations. He did not describe what it felt like to wait while shells landed close enough to kill him. When asked, he said only that he had done what needed to be done. That answer frustrated people who wanted something cleaner, something heroic in the traditional sense. But there was nothing clean about that decision. It was not bravery as it appeared in recruiting posters. It was not defiance shouted from a high point. It was arithmetic. One life weighed against many. One position traded to save an entire line. One voice kept steady while everything else collapsed inward. Years later, others would try to give that moment meaning. They would search for the right words. They would argue about whether it fit the definitions written down in peacetime offices. Medals would be discussed. Paperwork would move slowly through systems never designed to understand choices made under fire. None of that mattered in the ditch. What mattered was that when surrounded, retreat would have killed more men than standing still. When escape was impossible, turning your own position into a target was the only way left to deny it to the enemy. That truth sits uncomfortably beside everything armies teach. Because if it is accepted, then rules are not absolute, doctrine is not complete, and survival sometimes depends on breaking the very instructions meant to preserve it. The battlefield did not remember the name of the man who made that decision. The men who walked away did. And sometimes, that is the only record that ever truly existed. If this story stayed with you, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family served, share their story below. Every comment helps keep these memories alive.